Just a second, I'll give an intro here.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the latest edition of our sustainability series of webinars. This pre-National Drive Electric Week version here, focusing on electric vehicles. A couple quick housekeeping things as we get going. Everybody is on mute when you come into the webinar. If you do have questions as we go along, please type them into the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end. We will cover all the questions that come in. This webinar is also being recorded and put on the Green New York website, so if there's any slides you want to see afterwards, or if people want to share it with other folks, you can go to the Green New York website and find it there. Also, just like to give a quick thank you to everybody who participated in this summer's Green Your Commute Challenge. We had almost 10,000 green commutes logged. We had some good participation in that, so I'd like to thank everybody who was a part of it. In addition, National Drive Electric Week is coming up. It is September 14th through the 22nd, and there's a number of different activities and events throughout the state, so you can look up those online if you're interested in seeing some of the technology you're going to learn about today. In addition, Climate Week is also coming up, and that's September 23rd through the 29th. There's going to be quite a bit of focus on climate change policy and other activities and events going on that week. So if you want to get more involved, you can look up more things on that. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker today. It's John Markowitz from the New York Power Authority's Evolve New York program, and we'll let him take it away.
Thanks a lot, Brendan. And what I figured we'd do today is I'll talk about electric vehicle technology, the current state of things, some of the policy goals, and how EV adoption helps us meet those goals. What I'll do is I'll go through the slides pretty quickly to try to maximize the amount of time we have at the end for questions, because I think that's really the most interesting thing. And let's see, can I actually flip the slides, Brendan, or do you have to do it?
Yeah, you should be able to. If you just go over to the left-hand side, all the way, there'll be a little bar that comes up.
I see it now. Yep, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of policy, I've been in the EV space for about 20 years now, from the early research and development days. And, my main indication that this was starting to go mainstream was seeing some of these statements in the State of the State last year. And I have it in yellow highlight there, this key language. There was a goal to have 10,000 charging stations in New York by 2021. But the yellow text there is what knocked me off my chair. It was this goal of being the first state in the nation to make owning gas-powered cars obsolete. It was something I always saw in the long-term vision, that like when I got older, nobody'd have gas cars anymore, but to see like that in an official state document, that really knocked me out. So in terms of my personal credentials, I not only work on EVs, but I sort of live it. I've been driving a plug-in hybrid for several years now. My wife recently bought a full EV. We've been taking that on long road trips and fast charging it. And we charge the two cars on solar at home. So just in terms of familiarizing everybody with the terminology and what different cars are, we're all familiar with the conventional gas car. It's been around for 100 years. But a lot of people consider conventional hybrids, it's like a Toyota Prius, an electric car. I really don't. Because if you look at the fuel source for a car like that, it's a gas car. It basically has a tiny battery in it. It uses that battery to capture lost energy from rolling downhill. It reduces your fuel use by like turning the engine off when you're at a traffic light. So it's nice technology for reducing the amount of gas you use, but it does not transform the car from a gas-powered car to an electric car. So basically those next two categories are what I would consider an electric car. So the first one is a plug-in hybrid. So the battery here would be more than 10 times the size of the battery on an ordinary Toyota Prius. And basically what that allows you to do is to plug the car in and have some limited amount of mileage that you can drive that car as a pure electric vehicle, even at highway speeds, and then just not use gas those days where you're driving a short distance, which is the majority of days for most people. You drive less than 40 miles. So I drive one of these cars that has a 40-mile electric range. I looked at my total mileage over 6 years of ownership, and only about 10% of the time am I using gasoline. So 90% of the time, this car is operating as an electric car, and it's just with a 40-mile battery. Then there's the full battery-powered EV is the other type of technology we'll talk a bit about. So EV technology is really continuing to improve, and that's what this chart's displaying here. So if you look at that orange line, vehicle range for pure battery EVs in the last few years has increased from cars basically having like a range under 100 miles to cars being available now with up to range. Basically, battery costs are what's enabling this transition to happen. So costs are measured in dollars per kilowatt hour, where kilowatt hour is a unit of energy. And what is common knowledge is that within the industry is that once you get to around $100 per kilowatt hour, that battery electric cars become cost competitive with gas cars. And we think that that number is going to be achieved somewhere around 2025. So they won't be these expensive vehicles that they are today. And that charge speeds is something we're already seeing increase greatly. So when battery electric cars first came out, typically a fast charging event was considered 50 kilowatts of power. But we're seeing all the new cars coming out this year and in 2020 are all starting to introduce either 100 or 150 kilowatt charging, and we think that's just going to increase over the years. So the experience of taking one of these cars on a road trip is going to be more like a gasoline-powered experience. Oops, sorry, skip one slide there. The other thing we're seeing is that the new models of EVs coming out, people tended to think a full battery electric car was a Tesla. They were the only people building them. But we're starting to see them from all the automakers now at a whole bunch of different price points. So not just luxury cars, but also economy cars. And early on, they were all like these small, cute hatchbacks. We're starting to see them in wagons, SUVs, pickup trucks is the latest one. So there's going to be a lot more variety of cars in terms of sizes and price. Instead of running down this slide like note by note, there's a lot of programs going on in all the different state agencies, at DEC, at NYPA, at NYSERDA, DPS. But they basically fall into a couple of different buckets. There's regulatory kind of programs where we're regulating either the utilities or the car makers. As it goes to electric vehicles. There's rebate programs that either go to consumers or to municipalities for people to buy electric vehicles or charging equipment. And then there's some programs also to just do deployment work of getting charging stations installed and getting heavy-duty electric vehicles on the road. So I'll talk a bit about all this stuff in the following slides. So, we talked a bit about the vehicle terminology. This slide really talks about the charging terminology. So electricity is pretty ubiquitous, right? We have it at the places we work, the places we shop, we have it in our homes. So it's different from gasoline in that experience. And it's one of the things that makes electric vehicles wonderful. It's like you wake up every morning with a full tank. But people find charging confusing because it's just new. So this slide sort of talks through some of the basics. So you have your basic, 120 volt outlet on the left. And if you have one of these in your garage, you could plug an EV into it. Takes really, really long to charge at this rate. But if it's one of those plug-in hybrids, it's completely realistic in terms of the battery size, and it'll charge while you're sleeping. Although it'll probably take, a full 8 hours or so to charge, if not more. The more realistic option is what's called a rapid home charger or a level 2 charger. So instead of the wall outlet, which is about 1 kilowatt in terms of the power rating, this is more like 6 kilowatts. The destination charging stations that you see, that third one over, similar kind of power rating, but this would be a unit that you'd see in the public, like at a train station or a municipal parking lot. And then that last option is what's called a DC fast charger. And this is something you use on a road trip, so it'd be 25 kW or higher. And you know, the goal with this kind of equipment is to get the driver in and out in like 15 minutes or so. So the newest, highest speed units will do that. Most of the current units on the road are more like a half an hour stop. But it's on a long road trip, if you have a car with over 200 miles of range and you have to stop for half an hour for lunch to retop it up, it's sort of realistic. So, but that fast charging experience is getting better and better as the technology improves. So fast charging is where things get sort of confusing as well. That regular medium speed charging option that you would have at home, it's all a standard connector. And let me see, did I just jump? No, I didn't jump a slide. Sorry about that. On fast charging, there are actual multiple connectors, which makes it a little confusing. So Nissan uses a Japanese standard called CHAdeMO, which, if you speak Japanese, I've heard is a pun. It means stopping for tea. So I guess you stop for tea and you fast charge your car. And this photo on the bottom there is a picture of the front of a Nissan Leaf when it's charging. So you could see to the right is the standard connector you'd use at home that you'd find in the general public, and it's just like any other car. But then to the left of it is this larger connector you use for fast charging the car. So Nissan's still using this connector, but it's not really the US standard. The US standard is this one called CCS, or Combined Charging Standard. And we're seeing this on all the newer American-made, German-made, or Korean-made vehicles. And the top half of that connector is the same connector you'd use, for charging at home. It's your medium-speed connector. But the two big fat pins on the bottom are for your fast charging when you're out on the highway. And there's a picture of a Chevy Bolt EV that uses that type of connector. And then Tesla, because they came first with fast charging, has their own unique charging cable that they use. Here's an example of a home charger installed in a garage. So it's a pretty basic install. Depending on where your electric panel is relative to your garage, the cost of this could be anything from as low as maybe $200-300 to well over $1,000 to put in your home, just depending on whether the circuit breaker panel happens to be close to where you park your car or not. The actual hardware that's shown there on the wall retails for around $450. Here's an example of a public level 2 charger. This would be the same speed in terms of how it dispenses as the home one shown, but you'd find this in like a municipal parking lot. This particular charger has a cell phone modem on it, and it uses that cell phone to connect itself to the internet and to also bill the end user. So as an end user, you would use a phone app to turn this device on, then it would charge your car and then bill you for that service. And here's an example of a first generation DC fast charger. This is a 50 kilowatt machine installed on the Thruway in the Hudson Valley. There's 4 of these going north and south between New York City and Albany currently. And here's an example of a second generation DC fast charger. So at these kind of sites, you typically see 4 or more machines. So this is a better user experience because you don't have to wait if somebody's currently using the machine because there's 3 more of them. Also 3 times the charging speed, so 150 kilowatts. And basically on these machines, it'll go as fast as the car will let it. So if you have one of the older cars, it might only charge at 50 kilowatts, but it'll still work on an 150 kilowatt machine. But the goal here is to, be able to get somebody in and out while they're just having a quick sandwich or something, and then your car's full enough to continue on your road trip. So in terms of the policy objectives, transportation is a huge part of the state's greenhouse gas signature. It's more than the whole electric grid, the industrial sector in New York, and the commercial sector combined are the carbon emissions just from transportation. So electrifying transportation is really crucial. And a lot of times people talk about, well, what about the emissions of the power plant that's downstream of the electric car? And you do have to count that in when you're looking at an electric car. But the good news is that New York State, especially upstate New York, is the cleanest place in the country to drive an EV. Some of that's due to the hydropower that NYPA generates at Niagara Falls and on the St. Lawrence as well. But a lot of it's just due to New York retiring some of the older coal plants and some of the old oil burner plants. So it's a really incredibly clean place to drive an EV. In terms of EV sales progress to date, there's something called the ZEV mandate, Zero Emissions Vehicle Mandate, that requires the automakers to sell roughly 800,000 EVs in New York by 2025. So far, we've only hit around 50,000, so we're pretty far short of that target. And the chart on the left, the green bars are showing you plug-in hybrids, and the purple are showing full battery EVs. And you could see from when Tesla introduced their Model 3, that purple section really increased a lot. So on the early days, it was mostly plug-in hybrids, and now it's starting to trend more 50-50, which is common amongst other states like California. And in terms of EV charging, public charging stations, workplace charging stations, that's increased a good deal. The state met its goal of getting 3,000 charging stations installed by last year, and now we're working on this goal of getting 10,000 installed. Also trying to get a lot of charging stations installed at apartment buildings and at workplaces so we could serve people who don't have a garage at home where they could charge. But there's still a lot of investment that's needed in getting charging stations installed for the general public to use. And basically what this chart is showing, that 850,000 EV target that we have through that ZEV mandate would require well over 100,000 charging stations be installed. So that 10,000 charging station target we have is a bit short of what we're going to need. And these numbers are based on looking at the total number of apartment dwellers we have in the state. Someplace we're also very deficient in the state so far is DC fast charger installs. The people who own Teslas have their own fast charging network that only services those vehicles. So that current count of 500 DC fast chargers in the state is somewhat misleading, because when you look at the other brands, we're looking at less than 100 charging stations, fast charging stations around the state. That other East Coast states are a bit ahead of New York right now, and the total number of fast charging stations we have in New York are less than 10% of what California has. So there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done to make battery electric vehicles a comfortable choice for people driving around the state on long road trips. And the economics of installing this kind of equipment are very challenging. So because of that, NYPA introduced a program called Evolve New York. The goal here is to really build out that DC fast charging network all over the state, make those long road trips possible, close up the gap between the distance gap between fast charging stations to make these road trips more comfortable, and to install these at places that drivers would find convenient. So the vast majority of these are going to be located in private property in places like shopping malls, restaurants, places where you wouldn't mind spending 15 minutes or more to charge up your car when you're on a road trip. in places that would have the amenities you'd want, like food and bathrooms. The other thing is we've talked all about light duty vehicles so far, but what this slide speaks to is heavy duty vehicles being a fairly substantial piece of the pie for greenhouse gas emissions in the state. So heavy duty vehicles like buses and trucks, they represent only about 7% of the total miles traveled. They're a very small percentage of the total vehicle population, but they're a pretty large slice of the greenhouse gas emissions. So even though they represent like maybe 7% of the vehicle miles traveled, they represent 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state. So we have some programs to look at electrifying heavy-duty fleets. The primary one I'm involved in is transit bus electrification. But there are electric school buses, shuttle buses, delivery trucks. So this technology is maturing really rapidly. The MTA has a 10 electric bus pilot. Port Authority has started putting electric buses in at the New York airports. And we've been working with them on getting the charging equipment installed. And we're also working with several of the upstate transit agencies on their electric bus pilots as well, on getting the charging installed at the bus depots. But there are a lot of challenges to this. There are some utility regulatory issues that have to that speak to how we bill for electricity. There's also issues with just getting the bus depots ready to consume this huge amount of power. And to give you a feeling for the amount of power, the fast charging that we talked about for light duty vehicles is 150 kilowatt fast charging, which is the new standard for vehicles. This is considered slow charging for a bus. This is what you'd use to charge a bus overnight. So fast charging for a bus is more like 400 kilowatts, and this is done on the street while the bus driver would take their break. The size of the batteries on an electric bus are 6 or to 10 times more than a light duty vehicle. And it's not uncommon for there to be 200 or 300 buses in a single bus depot, which really makes a bus depot become something more like the Empire State Building from the utilities point of view in terms of the amount of power and energy that bus depot would consume. So huge challenges to getting it to 100% electric. And here are just some photos to give you an example of what a project like that looks like. Here are some of the electrical equipment that serves the bus rapid charger that's on West 42nd Street over by where the Circle Line terminal is. And here's what the hardware looks like. It looks like a big street light, basically. And this H-shaped electrical connector is motorized, and it mates with the top of the bus and charges up the bus in the 10 or 15-minute break that the bus driver gets before he continues his route again. And because bus depots are so dense, there's also a challenge on just getting cables to buses to charge them. So what we think the future of bus charging looks like is something like this. And this is a picture of an installation in Europe at an airport. But we think that there'll be parking lots like this with this kind of equipment where buses will charge overhead, or there'll be a similar kind of equipment inside a bus depot charging multiple buses at high speed. The other big challenge with electric buses and even electric light-duty cars is heating and cooling them. And this is something we take for granted with internal combustion cars, because there's a lot of waste heat in an internal combustion car that you can use to heat the cabin. You don't really have that. Electric vehicles are incredibly efficient in comparison to an internal combustion car, like more than 4 times more efficient. So you don't have that waste heat. So when you're heating the cabin of your electric car, it uses a resistive heater that consumes about 5 kW of power. So you'll find that on a really cold winter day, your range on an electric car can go down by about 30% just because you're heating the cabin. this becomes a whole lot worse on a transit bus because unlike your personal car, a transit bus, the doors are constantly opening and closing. So a lot of that cold air comes back into the bus and the hot air escapes. And the data we have from MTA is that on a 20 degree Fahrenheit day, a bus will consume 2.5 times the power that it consumes on a nice 70 degree fall day. So some really huge challenges too. We have to make the battery a lot bigger. And that was my final slide. And oh, okay. I thought I lost connection for a minute. So I'd like to open it up for questions now. And I just thank everybody for your attention.
Yeah, thanks, John. That was great. And we do have a number of questions that have come in here. The first one involves rebates and tax credits. The person notes that there's been some changes with the tax credits in terms of volume of sales and things. Can you address kind of the state of rebates and tax credits?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks. Electric cars are a little similar to putting solar energy on your house in that tax credits becomes part of the financial decision. I think it's unfortunate. I think there are better ways to incentivize this stuff, but this is what we have. So for electric cars, there's a federal tax credit. It's proportional to the size of the battery on the vehicle, but for like a full battery electric car, it maxes out at $7,500. And the current legislation is written in such a way that once an automaker hits 200,000 cars, the tax credit starts to sunset and it phases out over a series of months after that. So if you're looking at either a Tesla or a General Motors product, they've both hit that 200,000 mark, and their tax credits are starting to scale downwards, and they'll eventually hit zero, unfortunately, unless this tax credit's extended. And the automakers have lobbied the federal government on extending that tax credit further. Now, if you're looking at a car like a Hyundai, or a Kia, like one of the manufacturers who's just gotten into this, Audi would be another example, they still qualify for the full $7,500. The other piece of this equation is your point of purchase incentives. So NYSERDA is offering an incentive for the cars. That incentive is applied at the dealership level, and it's deducted off your total. And the NYSERDA rebate max is also proportional to the battery size, and it maxes out at $2,000. And that's a much nicer incentive because, like I said, it's applied at the dealership level, and they just subtract it off the total price of the car. And it also applies to leases, which is nice. The other complicating part of this with the tax credit is tax exposure, right? So if you're somebody, with 4 kids and a large mortgage, and you also try to apply for the EV tax credit, there's a possibility you could hit alternative minimum tax and not get the full $7,500 tax credit. So that's why I think the tax credit's not the ideal way to incentivize it. So it's something else you should look at. And if you lease the vehicle, that whole tax credit thing sort of goes away, and either the dealership or the automaker tries to take that tax credit and sort of discount the lease cost based on that. So because of that, about 90% of all EVs are leased and not purchased. So I know that was a long answer, but I hope I got to everybody's question on that.
That was great. We do have one comment here before the next question. Somebody on the line has a plug-in hybrid. They said they did over 1,000 miles with just 1 tank of gas last summer. So a testimonial there.
Yeah.
The next question we have, one of my concerns about an electric vehicle is the longevity of the batteries and understanding the potential replacement cost. Could you address this?
Yeah, it's a great question as well. In terms of battery life, the automakers are really conservative on this because by law they have to put an 8-year warranty on the battery system. So, and basically, you know, the less you like deeply discharge the battery, the longer it'll last. And you know, they've all designed it based on people's average commutes and trying to meet that 8-year warranty requirement. So the way the car maker warranties work is the batteries, typically they do what they call fade. So say you buy a car, it has 250 miles of range. As the car gets older, the battery will continue to work properly, but you'll see less and less range as the battery gets older. And people who like baby the car and only go on short trips and don't fast charge it much, their batteries will last longer than the person who's constantly going on road trips and deeply discharging the battery. But the way the warranties work is you can get up to 30% of battery fade before the warranty kicks in. So say like you had 35% less range in year 7 than when you bought the car. Basically, you would be able to invoke that battery warranty, and the car maker would have to swap out that battery based on the warranty. So, you know, I don't really see battery life as a major concern, and if you're leasing the car, it's a non-issue altogether.
Mm-hmm. So the next question here, could you speak at all to vehicle safety of electric vehicles?
Yeah, on the safety side, they do tend to handle it a bit better because most of these vehicles have a low center of gravity because the batteries are built into the floor. So they do drive nicely and feel pretty good. I guess in terms of like crash safety, you'd have to look at like the individual models and see how they rated. But in terms of like battery safety, they've built in a whole bunch of protections to prevent like a battery fire kind of condition. So most of these models have liquid cooled batteries, and they're also heated by that same coolant fluid. And you know, for especially upstate New York, I would really recommend looking at a battery that has the full liquid coolant system. But that's part of the safety system. They're also constantly monitoring voltages and temperatures across the battery pack. So the automakers have really, you know, worked hard on the whole vehicle safety side of it.
Mm-hmm. So next question here. I've heard the overall environmental impacts of manufacturing an EV battery can sometimes be more detrimental than the gas emissions that come from a gas-powered car. Do you have any additional information on the manufacturing process?
Yeah, I've seen those claims, and then I've seen studies countering all those claims. I guess the main items to consider in terms of the battery manufacturing and its environmental footprint are lithium, and then there are 3 other metals that are in the batteries. It's NCM, so I guess it's nickel, cobalt, and I believe it's manganese. So lithium is the largest contributor to the battery's materials. And I've heard the environmental footprint of mining lithium is not that huge. That basically like the carbon savings from driving the car over its life way outweigh the environmental footprint of mining lithium. That lithium basically is a salt that comes from like dry lake beds, like ancient lake beds. So it's found in a lot of deserts, and you don't have to dig deep for it. That a lot of the environmental footprint is just sort of refining the lithium from like the other salts that are built into these lake beds. The one that's a little more concerning is that letter C and the other 3 metals, the NCM, is the cobalt. The cobalt's very toxic. It's mined under poor conditions, like in places where, you know, human rights aren't always honored. So all the automakers have these programs to minimize the amount of cobalt in their batteries. And if you look at like the batteries in the newer cars, it's a different form of NCM chemistry where the ratio of nickel to cobalt to manganese is very different, and they use like a fraction of the cobalt of an electric car from a few years ago. But all the studies I've seen is that over the life cycle of the car, the emission savings from actually driving the car far outweigh the environmental footprint of manufacturing the battery.
Mm-hmm. And so the next question that we have here is, after the car has been used and the battery is degraded, what happens with the batteries?
Yeah, there are programs to recycle the materials on the battery, and I've seen different numbers on how efficient those programs are. I've heard over 90% of the materials can be recovered. And there is a lot of talk in the utility industry about battery second life. And there have been pilots of this. So basically, when the car is at end of life, that battery would be salvaged. And, maybe, it only produces 80% or so of its original capacity. But that's still useful for other purposes. So maybe, the car driver considers it a used asset because it doesn't give them the full range that they got used to when they bought the car. But to use it like to back up an electric power plant or install it at, like, say, a large solar field so that you could charge it up during the day and discharge it at night. That can still be attractive. So people are looking at the economics and the logistics of what they call second life batteries.
Mm-hmm. And the next question here deals with used EVs. Do you have any recommendations or things for people to look at, or warranty information if they're looking at a used EV?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I would look at on a used EV. If you're looking at a plug-in hybrid, you don't have to be quite as careful, like in terms of battery range. So say it's like a 6-year-old used plug-in hybrid. You only have 2 years left on that manufacturer's warranty. But, if you're going to operate it as a plug-in hybrid and that range fades a bit and the warranty is expired, you still have that gas engine to back you up. So you can afford the range fade a bit more than somebody who has a pure battery EV. So that's one thing to think about. My preference is to have a battery that's liquid cooled and heated over a car that doesn't have that. So like the Nissan Leaf does not have that feature. I think it makes it a little more challenging for that car in colder weather. And, if you're going to go for a full battery EV, you want to make sure it has DC fast charging. On a lot of vehicles, they make that an option. Like a higher cost option, and I think that should just be standard equipment on a full battery EV. So you want to definitely make sure that the car has that feature. And if you buy a used full battery EV, you just have to think, that at some point that manufacturer's warranty is going to expire, and you're not going to have that coverage on the battery, and the range can fade. But if you get the car at a low enough price, maybe that's an acceptable compromise.
Mm-hmm. The next question here, what's the most appealing aspect of a level 2 home charger? What's most important to consider when buying and installing one? Safety, compatibility, other concerns?
Yeah, one thing that you didn't list on that, which is a thing to consider, is cable length. So if you look at them, they'll have different cable lengths, and on all these EVs, the charging port is in a different location. So like on my car, it's on the front driver's side fender. I've seen other cars where it's on the rear fender, or some that it's right in the front hood. And, if you lease one of these cars, you have it for 3 years, and then you get a different model, and that charging port's in a completely different location. Having a cable that's another 5 feet long will make your life a whole lot easier. So that's one thing to look at. By far the most important thing to look at on a home charger is that it is UL rated. And if you buy it on Amazon, there are a lot of companies offering lower cost EV chargers for the home that are not UL rated, or they'll say something like has components that are UL rated, but the whole machine is not UL rated. And, this is an appliance that uses as much power as like an electric clothes dryer. So you really want something that's been tested by an independent third-party lab. So you want something that has that UL mark on it that's been tested by a lab. So you want something from one of the more reputable manufacturers. There are a bunch of them on Amazon. So like Clipper Creek is one of the smaller companies, but they make equipment that's UL rated. Some of the bigger companies like Siemens offers the equipment. So there are a bunch of them out there. They're all pretty good. They're all in that, $300 to $500 price range or so. You can get units with Wi-Fi on them. That comes with a phone app so you see its status. It costs a little extra, but some people like having that feature. The biggest concern really is where your electric panel is in terms of installing these.
Mm-hmm. So the next question that we have here, can you speak to the PSC's request to open up Tesla's supercharging stations to non-Teslas? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, it's one of those complex regulatory issues, right? That there were several state agencies that went before the PSC to talk about demand charge reform. And for those who aren't familiar with utility demand charges, electricity is billed in a very different way from gasoline. So gasoline, you just pay by the gallon. But any commercial entity that buys electricity, you pay both for the amount of energy you consume, but you also pay based on the flow rate of that energy. And that's what's called a demand charge. So like a big factory that, has a big, uses a ton of energy like in the morning, and then it like lowers down, will pay a lot more for their electricity than a factory that just uses the same amount of energy power all day. And this makes operating DC fast chargers really challenging. So folks like Tesla who operate DC fast chargers and other companies like EVgo that operate them, or state entities like NYPO or the Thruway that operate them, the economics of this become really challenging because you're using a lot of power for a short period of time, and then the unit's not used for several hours until the next car shows up. So it makes operating them very expensive. So we went for some reform on this issue, and basically the PSC ruled that Tesla, because their network is proprietary only to Tesla vehicles, should not get that regulatory reform on demand charges. So I mean that was the PSC ruling on it. There's a lot of history on why Tesla has a different connector from all the other car makers that probably should be considered. I'm not sure how much else. I think that addressed it, right?
Good. Okay. Yep. Yeah. So we've got two last questions here. If anybody does have any further ones, feel free to type them in. What is the cost comparison to gasoline when you're paying a fee at a fast charging station?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it tends to be more expensive than gasoline at most of the stations I've seen. So there's a whole other regulatory issue with DC fast charging in that in most states, you cannot charge by the kilowatt hour. That ends up making you a regulated utility. So all of these charging networks that allow you to fast charge instead have gone to a cost per minute kind of structure. When I've done the math on most of these, the cost per mile to fast charge is more expensive than the cost per mile to drive an equivalent gas car. And, I think cost per minute's not the best way to bill for this. It should be billed on a cost per kilowatt hour basis. One of the good things about New York is we changed that regulation a long time ago. So a fast charging network in New York can charge by the kilowatt hour. Tesla in New York is charging by the kilowatt hour for using these. And for their fast chargers, they are pretty close to the price of gasoline on a per mile basis when you look at what they're charging per kilowatt hour. The NIPA stations that we're just starting to build now, where our plans are to build by the kilowatt hour and to get it roughly equivalent to the price of gasoline on a per mile basis. The other part of that question, though, is the cost of charging at home does tend to be a good bit cheaper on a per mile basis than the cost of driving on gasoline. And that varies a lot by utility, that cost. But most of the utilities in New York have some kind of program to incentivize you to charge your car late at night when demand on the power plants are lower. And they'll give you some kind of a discount for behaving that way. And if you're in one of those programs, it could be as much as like a half the cost on a per mile basis if you're charging your electric car at home versus using gasoline.
Mm-hmm. And the last question that we have here, and this one's probably a bit tricky and has some assumptions in it, but we'll give it a go. In light of the fact that electric vehicles cost more than gas-powered vehicles, how many miles per year does somebody have to drive to make leasing an EV cheaper than leasing a gas-powered vehicle?
That is an awesome question. I've never done that math. And, it's going to depend a good bit on your electric utility and how many miles you drive per day. And I'm wondering, I'm trying to remember if I've seen a website that has one of those calculators where you could put in like a cost from one of your electric bills at home and like the cost of the lease and, your average daily commute, and it might do the math for you. I believe maybe Plug-in America or one of the other, or Sierra Club, like one of the NGOs that's active in this area, they might have a calculator like that on a website that would run you through the math, and you could see if the numbers work or not.
Yeah, that's great. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for jumping on the webinar today. I'd especially like to give a big thank you to John for jumping on and giving a great presentation and being prepared for the questions. That was great. So if you are thinking about joining the ranks of those that are driving electric, know that National Drive Electric Week is taking place the 14th through the 22nd. I believe there's over 20 events taking place throughout New York State. So if you go on their website, you'll be able to find one near you where you can see a vehicle. I think some of them have ride and drives as well, and learn more from owners themselves. So thanks again, John, and thanks everybody for jumping on today.
Thanks.